Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining our webinar today on the middle school grading assessment. It's a very big topic and a lot of ins and outs that might be very different from what you're used to in year 6. And I also know that there's some primary parents here as well. So this would also be useful for you as your child is moving through into year 7 for secondary. Okay, we're going to get started right away. We're going to start on time. And so I wanted to first introduce the two of us. We have Miss Georgeta here. Miss Georgeta is our IMYC coordinator. She's our middle school lead for curriculum and all things middle school related. And she's going to be going through all the details of what different types of grading, different types of assessments, how assessments look like for middle school, which is from year 7 to 9, okay? And I'm Mr. Chow, if you don't know, or Rico, and I'm the principal of secondary here at Verita. So I'm going to be moderating the chat, the Q&A. At any point, if you have a question, please do make sure you're using the Q&A function, and we'll make sure to answer all the questions by the end of the webinar. Okay, and I'll pass it off over to you, Mr. Jetta.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chow. Welcome, everyone. Good morning. Thank you so much for attending this webinar on understanding grading and assessment better for years 7, 8, and 9. I hope that you will find this useful in understanding how assessment works. And of course, if you have questions, just as Mr. Chow mentioned, please put it in the, use the Q&A function, and we'll try our best to provide clarification. Mr. Chow, if you could please move to the next slide. All right, so before talking about grading and assessment, it is important to understand a little bit the structure of the curriculum, to understand the framework that we are operating with. I'm going to walk you through 2 different aspects of the curriculum. And after that, we're going to look at how these 2 aspects merge together in and which is the version that we follow in order to make sure that our students reach their full potential. I'm going to refer first to the Key Stage 3 curriculum, which is part of the National Curriculum of England and Wales. Key Stage 3 refers to the spans from year 7 to 9. So we have year 7, 8, and 9, which is middle school. This curriculum sets out clear specific learning goals for each student that they should have when they leave Key Stage 3, right? So after year 9. If we could please go to the next slide. At the same time, here you'll have some examples of learning goals, extracts from Key Stage 3 for English reading, for instance. And if you go through the slide here, you'll see that pupils have different skills that they need to master by the end of Key Stage 3. It is important to remember that during these 3 years in middle school, students improve their skills in the various subjects that they're taking. All right, so our focus is in helping them achieve the best level for these skills, learning how to write an essay, for art, I don't know, learning how to draw a portrait, learning how to learning about color theory, and so on. All of these skills that they will acquire during these 3 years, they will use later when they go to high school, when they'll follow the next 2 levels, the next 2 curriculums, which is IGCSE and IB. So right now we're creating the framework, we're creating the base, we're teaching them how to learn, and we're trying to make sure that they improve in each area. So for instance, here you have an extract for reading. If we go to the next slide, you will find another example for writing, right? Write accurately, fluently, effectively, and at the length of pleasure information through. And we have all of these learning goals, all of these requirements that we must make sure as teachers that we follow and that we are teaching our students. On the other hand, and if we could please go to the next slide. On the other hand, we have the IMYC, the International Middle Years Curriculum provided by Fieldwork. The ones of you who have or who had your child in Verita in primary, you will find this very similar to the IPC, which is the version for primary, right? The curriculum that they use in primary. The IMYC is the extension, right? And it's dedicated for students from years 7, 8, and 9. Now, the IMYC is a really interesting curriculum. It focuses a lot on the development of the teenage brain, because we all know that our students and you as parents, you know that they go through so many changes. They have so many needs. They have emotional needs. We're not only talking about academics here, but they have social, emotional issues that they deal with, and it's a lot for them. So this curriculum is really great in terms of providing the framework for developing, good personal skills for them, not only to thrive in the academic area, but also, help them be rounded people who understand the world. And this specific curriculum is designed specifically for the unique learning needs of 11 to 14 years old, which is key stage 3, right? How does the IMYC work? Well, it's very simple. The IMYC provides a set of units dedicated for the different year groups. These units are meant to be taught in all of the subjects for a period of time, 8 to 10 weeks, and all the subjects connect to this unit. Each unit has a big idea which kind of defines the unit itself. It's basically the concept of the unit, if you wish. For instance, here you have an example of units: identity, adaptability, relationships. These are actually the units that we are doing with years 7, 8, and 9 as we speak. So it's the first unit of the year. There are many more. The IMYC has introduced the 2020 version, which is updated with units on wealth and on well-being and health. So they're constantly trying to improve and focus more on the development of the teenage brain. They also launched a series of podcasts where they invite neuroscientists to speak about the development of the brain during this period of time, and how us teachers and you as parents can help them and support them throughout this time. If you could please go to the next slide. Thank you. Now the IMYC, here you have a visual for the for the structure of the units. So throughout the unit, there are some steps that we follow, and students, of course, they follow these steps. A unit always starts with an entry point, which is basically an introduction. Then we have a period of time where we teach them content, but at the same time, they are doing a constant reflection on what they're learning, and doing a constant reflection on what's going on, not only in specific subjects, but also in all of the subjects. Of course, the focus is on the learner, on the student. After we teach them the content, and after we make sure that they are reaching, right, those skills that we need them to have by the end of the unit, we have an exit point. After all the summatives, after all the assessment, after all the teaching, there's this week at the end of the unit where they are able to choose a project that connects to what they've learned during that unit. The ones of you who have or had students last year in middle school, you're probably familiar with the exit point week. For the parents who are new to IMYC, in November, you will be able to see the projects for the first unit for your child. Now, I see a lot of questions, and we will try to answer all of those at the end during the Q&A section. Management, because I saw a question on management, and this links to the IMYC really nicely. There are some personal learning goals that the IMYC focuses on. One of those personal learning goals is also self-management, management in general. So we are trying to teach students how to manage their time wisely, how to manage themselves better through the curriculum, the SE curriculum that we are providing here at Verita. There's always this focus on making sure that the student is able to reach their full potential. And of course, this will only happen if they are, well in terms of emotions, socially speaking, and so on. So here, the process to facilitate learning speaks a lot about assessment, self-assessment, reflection, and the really interesting thing is at the end of a unit is to go through their reflective journals, because they have something, they have this journal. It's a digital one. It's posted on Google Classroom, where they write down reflections for each class. And it's really interesting to go through that at the end of a unit and see, the progress of the student, or how they think, or how they see the world now, how they interpret, what connections they make. All right, if you could please move on to the next one. All right. The emphasis is on interdisciplinary learning, because we are doing in every subject, we are linking to this big idea. Interdisciplinary learning happens. We have examples of interdisciplinary units in the past. These will also happen this year, where teachers have planned together a whole unit for the students, including the assessment, including the grading system, including every little project that they do. They also had classes together for the two different subjects. I can give you a very clear example here. We did for year 9 last year, we did music and art, and we spoke about impressionism, both in music and art. And the project that the students did at the end were absolutely amazing. And they did not only refer to art when they talked about the unit, but they also referred to musicians. So they made that connection. It was clear for them that there is a link between the subjects. But all of the subjects are linked together through this big idea, right? Even if the teachers do not plan together a unit per se, right? And always keep in touch with everything that's going on in both of the classes or 3 classes and so on, the subjects are linked through the big idea. For instance, for adaptability, which is the unit for year 7, the ongoing unit for year 7. In English, they look at how the main character of a novel needs to adapt to a new family. In art, for instance, they can look at how artists adapt depending on their physical condition. Some are blind, some don't have hands, and they can still paint and produce art, and so on. In PE, they can look at how sports teams must adapt to an opposing team strategies, and so on. So in each of the subjects, we linked to the main idea, and we try to show the student the connections. If you could please go to the next slide. Right. Besides interdisciplinary learning, we're also emphasizing inquiry-based approach. We have project-based learning. We have the reflection that is an ongoing process that I spoke about 2 slides back. So it is important for them to reflect on what they're doing, how they're doing, because this is how improvement can happen. If you don't know where you're struggling, you cannot, do something about it. But if you do identify what's wrong and how, then you can reflect and think and find strategies to to help students. Self and peer assessment. This is a crucial one. I will speak on behalf of my subject, because my area of expertise is art. I saw such great examples of self and peer assessment. Students can, sometimes when I'm not able to make myself clear to students to actually, make them understand what I'm trying to say, I have the strategy of asking somebody who understood from the class to explain again. And it's so amazing to see how this works and how the student who was struggling now is able to understand. And I'm also building some other skills in the students who is explaining. At the same time, when we're doing assessment at the end, it's always good to express thoughts about other people's work, right? If I'm talking about art here, because you can always have new ideas as the person who gets their work reviewed. You can always get new ideas, and you will improve your way of thinking. And learning through mistakes. Now, this is a big one. This is a big one. It is important for them to make mistakes. If they do not make mistakes, they won't build resilience. We want our students to be resilient. We want our students to make sure they face, whatever will come. They will have obstacles in their lives. It is important for them to understand that not every time things go well. Sometimes things go bad, and you have to find solutions in order to cope with what's happening and to solve the situation and so on. So making mistakes is really important. It builds resilience, and although it might be very overwhelming for some of them, very frustrating when a project doesn't turn out the way they wanted or the way they imagined, it is still a very good lesson to learn, because this is how they build other skills that are not only important for the academic part, but those are important for the future, right? They're lifelong skills. Backwards planning. We are doing backwards planning. When we think of a unit and when we plan our unit and what we want to teach the student, we always have in mind what we want them to know at the end and what we want them to do at the end, right? So we always have that final project in mind. And based on that, we choose specific learning goals in order to make sure that they are able to reach and to thrive at the end of the project. Emphasis on skill rather than content. This is something that I mentioned before. It is important for them to build the good skills during these years in middle school, because when we go to high school for IGCSE and IB, then it will be much more focused on content. But you cannot apply content if you do not have the skills. So it's important for them to learn how to write, how to think, how to solve different tasks for the various subjects. Mr. Chow. Now, how do these two curriculums work together? Because I told you that I'm going to walk you through two different paths, and after that, we're going to look at how these two link together. Well, we have the IMYC and we have the Key Stage 3, and if we could please have the next slide. Right, and now you see them merged. So basically the Key Stage 3 and the IMYC merged together. And it's important to mention, and if we could please go to the next slide. It's important to understand that the IMYC serves as a framework and the Key Stage 3 provides the content. Now, the IMYC turns the Key Stage 3 into an inquiry-based approach form of curriculum, right? It makes learning Key Stage 3 more intuitive, experiential, and engaging. They merge together, right? And they actually created the document that I'm going to talk about later, where they've merged the learning goals for the IMYC and the curriculum, national curriculum of England and Wales. It's called the cross-reference document that we follow as guideline when we decide the learning goals for each unit that we do with students. At the end of the 3 years of middle school, they should have, we should have taught them at least, or we should have put in our planning at least once each of the learning goals that it's mentioned in the cross document. If we could please go to the next slide. So here you have a sample of IMYC and Key Stage 3 cross-reference. So basically, we have the subject content, which is this time I think it's also for English. And then if you look on the right, it says students will, and these are our learning goals, right? Be able to read and comprehend for different purposes, including stories, dramas, poems, and literature, and so on. So we look at these learning goals, and when we plan, we include those in our planning to make sure that we create the base for them to develop the skills. All right, please, Mr. Chow. All right, now, after talking about grading and assessment, and I'm going to check the time because I'm afraid that it's a little bit late. I'm going to walk you through the assessment and grading system, right? After understanding the framework and understanding how the curriculum works, it's important for us to have a conversation on assessment and grading. Students during the 3 years, 7, 8, and 9, have two different types of assessment in school. We have the formative assessment and we have the summative assessment. The formative assessment do not count for the report card. So the grades that they will get for the formative assessment will not go in the report card, but they will influence the report card. And I'll come back to you and I'll explain how and why. And the summative assessment, which are graded for reporting. Now, students will be assessed on a subject specific to from 0 to 8 scale for their formative and summative assessments. So we're using the same scale, the same rubric for formatives or for summatives. For the report cards, the grades will be reported on a 1 to 7 scale for all subjects, and I will explain how this works. If we could please go to the next slide. Let's dive in a little bit into formative assessments. These are mini assessments during the unit of study. Tests, quizzes, small projects, depending on the subject, depending on the teacher, depending on the unit, depending on the content, right? So there are a lot of ways of giving formative assessments throughout the unit. If they do receive grades, those are not counted towards the final grade, but there is one thing to keep in mind. For instance, if a student scored for the formative assessment for criterion A, only 5, 3 grades of 5. And at the end, for the same criterion, during the summative, so after they get they submit the summative, they get a 7, but they did the work was the project was a group, it was a team effort. Then of course the teacher will decide what is the final grade, right? So there are situations that we need to consider when formatives might influence, of course, the final grade. But the formative, the most important goal is to provide constructive feedback and to assess the student's current understanding. So we are giving feedback when we give a summative, when we give a formative. It is important for them to understand where they are, where they need to improve, where they're struggling, and what can they do in order to make sure that they reach their full potential at the end. Feedback can be verbal, can be through student conferences, can be written. Sometimes we even record the video, the feedback. Many times I use an app, Vocaroo is called, then I just record my message and I send it to students. So it really depends on the project. Now, if we could please go to the next slide and talk a little bit about summative assessments. These are the final assessments at the end of each unit. These are counted towards the final report card grade. It's basically a sum assessment of the content and skill learned in a unit of study. This assessment can take many forms. Again, they can have tests, they can write essays, they can do projects, they can do research, they can do quizzes. It really depends on the subject, the unit, and the teacher. Now, for the summative assessment, and the ones of you who have who had your child in Verita last year, or up until now, you know already that we provide feedback at the end of the summative, and it's a detailed feedback, either that we write it or we record it. It is important for us to make sure that we give feedback, because through feedback, students can improve. right? If we don't tell them where they're struggling, they'll never be able to take the next step. So please remember that the summative assessment grades do count for the report card. If we could please go to the next slide. Now, the summative assessment requirements are shared with students, first of all. When we introduce a project, or it depends on the format of the summative, we also have a document in which we tell students exactly what the task is and what they need to focus on, what are the criteria they're being assessed on, what are our requirements from them, including the due date and so on. Students receive either a physical copy or an electronic copy. This is usually posted on Google Classroom. Every teacher goes through the requirements with the students at the beginning of the summative. Parents also receive an electronic copy of the assessment. The teacher usually, when they introduce the summative assessment, email the parents, letting them know that the students have started the summative assessment period, and here are the requirements for this specific subject. All of these are sent to you by email, but we can also include them in the newsletter if you wish, the newsletters that you get every 2 weeks. Now let's talk a little bit about grading and about the rubric. Each subject will have their own subject-specific rubric. So we have these rubrics as guidelines, and for each unit and assessment, we will only focus on a few criteria, and I will explain why. Can we please go to the next slide? Here you have an example of criterions used for different subjects. For English, for instance, we have 4 criterions: A, B, C, D: analyzing, organizing, producing text, using language. Humanities: knowing and understanding, investigating, communicating, thinking critically. For art, we have knowing and understanding, developing skills, thinking creatively, responding, and so on. So for each subject, we have 4 different criterions, 4 different areas for assessing the student. If we could please move to the next slide. Here you have some more examples for math and for science. And are all 4 criterions used for each assessment? The answer is no. What we try to do is, at the end of a term, is to make sure that the student was assessed at least once for each criterion, because these grades that they get for the 4 criterions will go in the report card and will determine their final grade for that subject. So for one unit, I might assess 2 criterions. For another unit, I might assess the other 2. I might do 3. I might do mini summatives and assess the same criterion more than one time in order to make sure that the student reaches their full potential. So it really depends on the unit and on the structure of the summative. If we could please go to the next slide. All right, and here you'll have an example of a year 8 assessment for, and you can clearly see the grade. If you look up, it says criterion A2, right? Buddhism. And if you read what the student answered for the question, what is Buddhism? Buddhism, you'll see that for the first example where the student got a 2, right? They said Buddhism is basically life is like a river. You follow it and cannot change. Now, if you go down and if you look at the descriptors, the rubric is criterion A, knowing and understanding. If you look at 1 to 2, yeah, the rubric, you can read the descriptor. The student makes limited use of terminology. This is the key word to focus on, limited. That's the descriptor. If we go to the next slide, you'll see an example of an 8 that another student got, right? Now, the student got an 8, and you can see the difference between the 2 types of answers, the 2 types of understanding what Buddhism is. If we could please move on to the next slide. Okay, so we look at the descriptors when we grade. Now, how does report card calculation work? as I told you, for each criterion, we will have at least 1 grade per term. At the end, if we have more than 1 grade, we will sum it up and we will determine the final grade. You'll see here an example for criterion A. If the student got the 6, 6, a 5, and a 6, it's a 6, right? If they got the 5, 4, 5, 5, it's a 5. It's if they got the 6, 6, 5, 4, it's a 5, right? At the end, after we determine the final grade for each criterion, we sum it up and we'll have a total of marks. After we do that, we have the grade boundaries, and you will see displayed on the bottom of the slide how the grade boundaries work, right? So if, for instance, if I look at the total marks, the 21 marks, I go to level 5, which is 19 to 23, and the final grade that the student will get for English is 5. Okay, so this is important for you to understand. When you get the report card, look at the criterions, look at the grades, see how many marks they got, and after that, look at the grade boundaries. Everything is on the report card that you will get, all of this information. If we could please go to the next slide. Now, you can tally up the questions in the following manner. For instance, if I give a test to a student and I have 4 different levels, right? I have level 1 questions and the student got 5 out of 10 questions right. They got 50% of the marks. Same for level 3 and 4. Then for 5 and 6, 7 and 8, they got 100% right. Now, when I grade the student, I will look at all of this information. And although they did very well for levels 3 and 4, which are the highest levels, they didn't do so well for 1 and 2. So the student would still get a 6, right? Because the lower questions from 1, 2, 3, 4 pull their grade down. It's more of a holistic judgment here. You have to look at the rubric, you have to look at the answers and make a holistic judgment. Next slide. Right? Why is it so complicated? Now, I mentioned descriptors. We are looking at the descriptors when we grade. Now, because we are looking at the descriptors and because we have these different criterions that the students get assessed on for each subject, it's very easy, or it's useful for them because they know in which area they can improve. You can have 2 students who got the same grade, overall grade at the end, or the same grade on a test, let's say, or on a project. But one of them might have done really well for criterion A and not so good for criterion B. On the other hand, the second student might have done really well on criterion B and criterion A. The fact that we have more criterions to assess, it's really good because, of course, we all have our strong, we have strengths and weaknesses, and we are able to showcase our strengths and, of course, make sure that we can improve the weaknesses by reading the teacher's feedback, by doing the work, by following the requirements, and so on. When you are using, so we are not, when we grade, we do not look at the grade in terms of percentage, we look at the descriptors. And the 0 to 1 scale and subject-specific rubrics ensure consistency in terms of assessing across subjects. Now, please read the rubric. When we send the requirements for the summative, we will always have the rubric. We'll always write down the criterions that are being assessed on. And when they get the grade back, right, that rubric will give you information about your child's performance rather than a sheer percentage grade. Okay, if we could please go to the next slide. It's already 10:34. I apologize for running late. As I told you, the rubric gives you information about your child's performance. And a grade of 85%, let's say, does not tell you much in terms of what the child needs to improve. But when the student receives a grade for 4 different criterions for each subject, you can visualize and understand which skills they need to improve on, right? Because it's very clear. In my class, for instance, I might have students who are very skilled in representing different subjects, but they might not be so creative, right? But on the other hand, I might have students who are extremely creative and they're not so skilled yet, or they still need practice in terms of drawing, portraiture, doing landscapes, using different techniques and so on. So it's always good to have this balance and be able to make sure that students are able to shine and to show their potential in the different areas. All right. If we could please go to the next slide, which is about questions. So now we have a few minutes for questions. Mr. Chow, if you could help me here, I'm trying to go through the chat.
Yeah, so we have a question. It says, regarding the curriculum content, does every teacher decide the content of their own subject, or is there a school-wide curriculum content per subject and per year that the teacher uses like primary?
So for this question, yes, we are using the Key Stage 3 for content. We are also following the IMYC, which gives us clear examples of what the student, it's like a guideline for different topics that we could approach for the different units. But we have the learning goals, and when we read the learning goals, it's very clear for us what students need to know by the end of Key Stage 3 or by the end of year 9. So the Key Stage 3 provides the content, yes.
So, and something just to add on top of that to clarify is that in terms of in secondary, especially with year 7 to 9, we're much more focused on the skill rather than content, because skill and content, these are two very different areas. So even though we might not be covering, let's say we're not talking about World War II, but we're talking about another historical aspect, but actually we're focusing on the skills and the skills of research. So you keep this in mind with year 7 and 9, is much more focused on the development of research skills, writing skills, creativity, self-management, rather than, oh, they have to know all of these dates, they have to know all of these artists, they have to know all of these books. So it's a bit different in that sense. But yes, the Key Stage 3 is the basis for the curriculum. And teachers basically look at it and pick out the contents, pick out the strands that support the unit that they're doing. All right. I hope that answers your question. Yes, you can get the presentation. We will email it as a follow-up. And then we have another question. It's the level scale 1 to 8 and grading scale 1 to 7 are different. So it's a bit confusing. Could you clarify that?
All right, so this is my my bad, because I did not mention this. For each criterion, they get assessed from 0 to 8, scale from 1 to 8. At the end, after they get their overall grade, that grade is from 1 to 7. We are using the IB system in order to create consistency throughout years, because when they'll move on to high school, it's important to, already have the experience of looking at the descriptors and understanding where they are. So we are using the 1 to 7 for the overall grade. And that 1 to 7 grade is based on the grade boundaries that I talked about earlier, which is, of course, it depends on the total of marks that the student gets for each criterion.
Just to add to it, I guess the easiest way for a parent to think of it is this: the 1 to 8 scale is the specific grades for each skill or each criteria of that subject. The 1 to 7 scale, as Mr. Georgeta has said, is the overall subject grade. So if you're thinking about like an overall subject grade, oh, did they get an A in maths? Well, that's the 1 to 7. But when we're talking about the 1 to 8, it's, oh, how did they do in analysis? How did they do in creativity? So that might help you a little in terms of clarification. And then we have another question. It's, do the teachers link each big idea to something in real life, and how is it applied to real life situations? So are we making connections from the big idea, the things we're teaching, to beyond the classroom?
Yeah, so every teacher tries to make connections with the real world, because I think this is the most important aspects for students to understand that we are a community. We are part of this, world, and understand the situations that they are that we are facing. For science, for instance, they did environmental change, and last year for the for the exit point, I remember very clearly the year sevens connected their exit point ideas to this topic that they've learned in science. So yes, we are always trying to do that and to link to real life situations. We have examples of speakers coming and discussing different situations in history class at some point. Last year, the teacher invited one of the parents who was actually could speak about a political situation that they experienced. So yes, we are trying to do that.
Great, thank you. And then we have another one, so I can take those. Is IMYC curriculum compatible across all international schools? It's a yes and no question, because it really depends on the international school curriculum you're going to and the context you're going to. Because if you're going to a strictly, let's say, British international school, and they follow the Key Stage 3 curriculum, well, then it's very by the books. It's very much rote learning. It's very much more rigid, right? But if you're going to, let's say, other schools who are taking much more of an inquiry base and much more focusing on skill-based and conceptual-based learning, then yeah, the IMYC is a compatible curriculum for those schools, because you have to remember that every international school has their own vision of how a middle school works. At least from our experience, a lot of the inquiry-based schools, international schools, their middle school is much more focused on building the skills, building the concepts, so they're actually able to have the tools to tackle the content in high school. So it's a bit of a yes, no question. It depends on which school you're going to. If you're going to another IMYC school, another inquiry-based school, or another IB school, of course. But if you're going back to even if it's an international school, but let's say that international school follows an inquiry-based curriculum, but they're also required to follow a state curriculum, because there's a lot of these anomalies you have to be aware of, then that might not be such a good gel or transition. So it depends. That's the answer. I hope that answers your question. Great. Thank you all for coming. Thank you very much to Mr. Jetta for going through a lot of information in such a short time. We hope that was useful for you, and we'll send this presentation and recording out in the next few days. And if you have any question, please don't hesitate to email any of us for further questions or inquiries you might have. Okay. Thank you very much, everyone. And thank you for joining us, and have a wonderful day. Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you,
Take care.
everyone. Have a great day.